All right, let's jump right in. Today's deep dive is all about unmasking autism, discovering the new faces of neurodiversity. And let me tell you, this book by Devon Price, a social psychologist, really made me think, especially about what it means to be autistic in a world that isn't always, you know, understanding.
Oh, absolutely. Devon Price is a really prominent voice in the autistic community. And this book digs deep into masked autism. Basically, it's when people, often unintentionally, learn to suppress their autistic
Kind
traits.
of like camouflage, right? Trying to blend in when you feel different. So for our listeners, we're going to break down this deep dive into unmasking autism in a structured way. First up, we'll lay out all the essential book details, the title, the author, all that jazz. Then we'll get into the juicy stuff, the main themes of the book. But don't worry, we're staying spoiler-free today. Think of it as a sneak peek to help you decide if this book's your cup of tea.
We'll both share our own thoughts on the book, too, what really stood out to us.
Sounds good. So let's get down to brass tacks. Unmasking Autism, Discovering the New Faces of Neurodiversity by Devon Price. Came out in 2021, published by Avery, which is part of Penguin Random House. They're known for their psychology and self-help stuff. Now, the book dives into this concept of masking. It's where autistic individuals, and often they're not even consciously aware of it, they start changing their behavior to hide their autistic traits.
Yeah, the book kind of frames it as like a survival technique, right?
Yeah.
A way to navigate a world that doesn't always get neurodiversity. Price argues that masking, while it might help in the short term, it can really take a toll on a person's mental health and well-being. It can lead to feeling totally drained, isolated, even like hating yourself.
And he brings in these powerful quotes from autistic individuals. It makes the whole experience of masking so relatable. There's one that stuck with me. Someone described feeling like a joyless, unlovable asshole because they were always trying to suppress their true self. It's heartbreaking. It really shows the emotional baggage that comes with masking.
And it's important to remember masking isn't about being deceptive. It's often like an automatic response to the pressures of society and wanting to avoid the bad stuff, like being bullied or excluded.
Yeah. And the book highlights how masking can be even more common for certain groups. Think autistic women, transgender individuals, people of color. They often face extra pressure to fit in.
Right. There's this whole idea of intersectionality. Price talks about how race, gender, socioeconomic status, all that, it intertwines with autism. And that creates unique challenges for people just trying to exist in a world that isn't always so welcoming to difference.
The book shares some really personal stories, like Bobby's story. Bobby's non-binary and masked their autistic traits for years. They just couldn't understand why they felt so different. These personal stories, they really put a human face on the whole experience of masking and give a voice to those who've been pushed to the sidelines or just misunderstood.
It actually reminded me a bit of Divergent Mind by Janara Narenberg. That book also looks at the challenges neurodivergent people, especially women, face in a world that kind of pushes for everyone to be the same. Both books, they shine a light on the big systemic issues that contribute to this whole masking thing, and they make it clear. We need way more understanding and acceptance of neurodiversity, and we need it now.
I totally see that connection. Both books are incredibly powerful and really give you insight into the lives of neurodivergent people.
Yeah. And even though the book focuses on the tough stuff, the challenges, it also offers hope and a sense of empowerment through this idea of unmasking.
So unmasking, it's kind of like a journey of self-discovery. It's about ditching those camouflages and really embracing who you are as an autistic person.
And Price makes it clear, unmasking isn't about chucking all your coping mechanisms out the window or becoming a completely different person overnight. It's more like, gradually figuring out which behaviors aren't working for you anymore and letting them go, letting your real self shine through.
I really like that perspective, finding that sweet spot, right? Honoring your true self while still navigating a world that's not always designed with neurodiversity in mind.
Exactly. It's not like you have to go all in or all out. It's about making choices that fit with your own values and needs.
So what does the book say about actually doing this unmasking thing?
Well, there's a ton of practical advice and exercises to help people get started, like exploring your special interests more, setting boundaries, and finding your tribe, your people, the ones who really get you and support your neurodiversity.
He actually suggests doing a special interest week,
Right.
right? Where you spend the whole week rediscovering those passions that might have gotten buried under all the masking. I thought that was a pretty brilliant idea. Encourages people to explore who they are and celebrate all those unique things that make them special.
Absolutely. It's all about self-expression, finding ways to be your true self.
That's what unmasking autism boils down to, right?
Exactly.
Embracing who you are and challenging those norms that try to box us in.
All right, so we've talked about the main ideas in Unmasking Autism, but now I want to hear what really jumped out at you. What parts of the book really stuck with you?
Honestly, the part about the long-term consequences of masking was pretty eye-opening. Price connected to all sorts of issues, like higher rates of eating disorders and substance abuse among autistic people. It's heavy stuff.
Yeah, it makes sense though, right? Masking can disconnect you from your own needs and feelings, makes it harder to deal with stress in healthy ways. The book talks about how some people might turn to like substances or messed up eating habits to just kind of numb the pain that masking causes.
Price tells this story about Thomas. He used alcohol to deal with the sensory overload he felt in social situations. It just, it really shows how masking can have these ripple effects, impacting all these different areas of a person's life. It made me think about how important it is to understand what's going on beneath the surface.
Totally. It's a plea for empathy, for trying to understand what people are going through, not just judging their actions. We got to look beyond the mask.
There's also a part where the book talks about how masking can be linked to autistic people getting drawn into these high control groups or abusive relationships.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point that doesn't get talked about enough. That need to fit in, to please other people, it can make folks vulnerable to being taken advantage of. Price described these high control groups as organizations or relationships where there's like a strict pecking order, tons of rules, you're expected to just fall in line. And for people who are masking, that can be really appealing because it gives them a sense of structure. But it comes at a cost. They lose their independence.
Yeah, it's a wake-up call. Unmasking isn't just about feeling good. It's also about staying safe and protecting yourself from people who might exploit you.
And something else that really stood out to me was Price's discussion of how masking affects communication and relationships.
Oh, yeah. He talks about how it can lead to all sorts of misunderstandings, right? Like you're constantly second-guessing what other people want instead of just being yourself.
Exactly. He gives this example of autistic people using like scripts, where they rehearse conversations in their head beforehand to avoid awkwardness. It's a coping mechanism, but it can make interactions feel really unnatural.
The book encourages autistic people to be more direct with their communication, to say what they need and what their boundaries are.
It emphasizes authenticity, even if it feels a little uncomfortable at first. Being real with people builds stronger relationships.
But it's not just about autistic people changing how they communicate,
Well,
right?
no, not at all.
Hmm.
It's about everyone being more thoughtful and understanding. Price says we need to listen carefully, be patient with different communication styles, and not make assumptions about what other people are thinking or feeling.
That reminds me of this idea of radical acceptance that I've seen in other books. Accepting people for who they are, not trying to change them.
That's a great connection, creating a space where everyone feels safe to be themselves.
One of the things that really hit home for me was Price's call for creating a more neurodiversity-friendly world. He challenges us to rethink what we consider normal and to fight for changes that accommodate different ways of being.
And he gives concrete examples of how to make environments more inclusive, like sensory-friendly spaces with dim lighting or quiet areas. Those benefit everyone, not just autistic people.
He also talks about rethinking those traditional work structures like the 9-to-5 grind and time management expectations.
Yeah, he argues that the whole 9 to 5 thing, where you're expected to be productive all the time, it doesn't work for everyone, especially people who might thrive on flexible schedules or different work environments.
He even shares this story about Sue, an autistic person who felt really stifled by the traditional work structure. She ended up starting her own business so she could set her own hours and work in a way that suited her.
Right. It's about recognizing that what success looks like or what's considered efficient, it's different for everyone.
Exactly. We need a society that values and supports a whole range of talents and working styles.
And the book also talks about how crucial it is to educate people about neurodiversity, to bust those myths and stereotypes, and to promote more understanding and acceptance.
Yeah, no more fixing people. It's about changing attitudes and structures to embrace differences.
It's about recognizing that neurodiversity isn't a bad thing, it's just a natural variation in human experience.
We need to celebrate those unique strengths and perspectives that neurodivergent people bring to our communities.
There was one part that gave me pause. When Price talks about abolishing carceral systems, while I get his concerns about how those systems can really harm neurodivergent people, I'm not sure if completely getting rid of them is realistic or even the best solution.
I hear ya. It's complicated, right? There's no easy answer. We can't ignore the harm those systems cause, but we also need to think about what realistic alternatives there are.
Maybe instead of pushing for total abolition, which might be tough to pull off right now, we should focus on reforming these systems, making them more humane, more responsive to the needs of neurodivergent people.
I agree. Finding that balance between pushing for big changes and working within the system to make things better right now.
And as much as I admire Price's call for radical visibility and unmasking, I think it's important to remember that not everyone feels safe being openly autistic.
Right. We got to acknowledge that. It's a personal choice. And what feels empowering for one person might feel scary or overwhelming for someone else.
Especially for people who might face discrimination because of their neurodiversity. We got to respect individual choices. There's no one right way to be autistic.
One thing that really struck me was how Price weaves in personal stories with scientific research. It makes the information really relatable and believable.
I totally agree. It's not just some dry, boring textbook. He uses humor, he tells stories, and it makes the topic engaging, even for people who are new to this whole idea of neurodiversity.
It feels like he's having a conversation with you, just sharing his insights and experiences in a really genuine way.
Yeah, and he doesn't shy away from his own struggles with masking and unmasking. It makes him feel so relatable as an author.
There's this part where he talks about bottom-up processing, which is more common in autistic people.
Oh, yeah. He explains how autistic individuals tend to focus on the details and process information in a really systematic way, like building their understanding from the ground up. It's different from the top-down processing that's more typical for neurotypical people. They rely on context and stuff they already know to make sense of new information.
It's super interesting. It shows how our brains can work differently and how those differences affect how we experience and interact with the world.
We need to recognize and respect those differences instead of trying to force everyone to think and process information in the same way.
Reading this book got me thinking about my own experiences and biases. Like, how can I be more understanding of neurodiversity in my own life? How can I be more accommodating?
I had the same reaction. It's a book that makes you think long after you've finished it. It makes you question your assumptions and strive to be a better ally.
There's this one quote that really hit me. The opposite of alienation is integration, a psychological sense of connection and wholeness. That, to me, sums up what Unmasking Autism is all about.
It's about belonging,
Okay.
feeling connected to yourself and to a community that embraces those differences.
It's about recognizing that our differences don't have to divide us. They can actually enrich our communities and make us all stronger. Okay, so as we wrap up our deep dive into Unmasking Autism, I think the big question is, what can our listeners actually take away from this? Like, how do we apply all this to our own lives? It's packed with info, but where do we even start?
Yeah, it really is. But it's not just information, it's full of things you can actually use. For me, the biggest thing is just realizing how diverse the autistic community is. There's no single autistic experience. If we want to make a more inclusive world, we got to get that.
Yeah, we got to move past those stereotypes and see people as individuals, not just labels. It's so important to recognize that everyone experiences autism in their own way.
And even if you're not autistic, just understanding what masking is, how it works, that can change things. Makes you more empathetic. You start to see how societal pressure can force people to hide who they really are. It can change how you interact with everyone.
It makes you think twice before making assumptions. What are people really going through? What's behind the mask?
For anyone listening who is autistic, this book is like, hey, you're not alone. There's a whole community out there embracing neurodiversity. We're celebrating those differences.
And Unmasking Autism gives you a way to start that journey, to discover yourself. It's about ditching those masks and being who you truly are. But it takes time, right? It's a process. And the book has some really practical advice and exercises to help you along the way.
Yeah, like finding your people. Price calls them your strawberry people. Those are the ones who truly get you, neurodiversity and all. Having those people around makes all the difference.
And for our listeners who aren't autistic, this book is a great guide to being a better ally. It's about really listening, respecting different ways of communicating, and understanding that what works for one person might not work for another.
Even little things can make a big difference. Give clear instructions, be aware of sensory stuff, respect people's boundaries. It's not rocket science, but it can make a huge difference for autistic people.
It's about creating a space where everyone feels comfortable being themselves.
And think bigger, too. We can all fight for a more neurodiversity-friendly world. Push for accessible spaces, challenge those harmful stereotypes, create opportunities for autistic people to thrive.
It all starts with education.
Right.
The more we understand about autism and neurodiversity, the better we'll be at creating a world that's truly inclusive and fair.
Yeah, totally. We got to shift from this idea of fixing people to accepting and celebrating them for who they are.
Unmasking autism really drives home the point that unmasking can help you find your purpose. It can help you live a more authentic life.
It's about peeling back those layers and being your true self, and understanding that neurodiversity isn't a weakness, it's just different. And those differences are valuable. They bring something unique to our communities.
This book is a call to action. It's a challenge to create a world that's more just, more inclusive, a world that embraces neurodiversity, and it starts with each of us.
Yeah, definitely check out the book. Maybe give that values-based integration exercise a try. Price lays it all out. It can help you make sure your actions match up with who you really are, autistic or not.
As we wrap up this deep dive, we want to leave you with something to think about. What can you do, even something small, to be more accommodating to neurodivergent people in your life? What can you do to help build a world where neurodiversity is celebrated?
Remember, change starts small. It starts with awareness, with listening, and with being open to learning.
Thanks for joining us on this journey into unmasking autism. We hope it's given you some new perspectives and encouraged you to embrace the amazing power of neurodiversity.